The Civil Rights Movement, 1945 to 1966. Following World War II, African American demands for equality began increasing, leading to the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. The World War II experiences of African Americans laid the foundations for the civil rights struggle. Mass migration to the North brought political power to blacks, especially in urban Democratic Party politics. President Harry Truman indicated his support for civil rights programs, leading to a Democratic split in 1948. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, grew in numbers, and its Legal Defense Fund initiated a series of lawsuits to win key rights, while activist Freedom Riders directly challenged segregated buses. Jackie Robinson's entrance into Major League Baseball and Ralph Bunche's Nobel Peace Prize exemplified African Americans breaking the color barrier. A new generation of jazz musicians created bebop, a sophisticated music that operated independently of mainstream white tastes and refused to cater to white stereotypes of black musicians and music. In the South, where half the nation's 15 million blacks lived, segregation and unequal rights were still the law of the land. Law and custom kept African Americans as second-class citizens with no effective political rights. Few voted, and physical violence kept potential troublemakers in line, as Emmett Till's family learned in 1955. Patience and stoicism were survival skills for African Americans in the South, but Till's murder in Mississippi was widely reported in black publications, even while much of the white press ignored or downplayed the story. Emmett Till was a young teenage black boy from Chicago who went to stay with his cousins and down in the South. And what happened was that they went to a store in this one white town, and Emmett Till apparently said something slightly flirtatious to the white woman working behind the counter. She reported it to her husband, and her husband and his relatives went to where Emmett Till was staying, and they brutally murdered Emmett Till. Demographic changes also challenged Southern patterns of life, as increased industrialization and improved farming techniques brought more black and white Southerners into cities and towns and in closer contact with each other. Here we see institutionalization of segregation, with signs designating white and colored restrooms, waiting rooms, benches, water fountains, and so continual reminders of the segregation between black and white. Starting in the 1930s, the NAACP initiated a series of court cases that challenged the constitutionality of segregation. In Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, argued by Thurgood Marshall, sociological studies by Kenneth Clark provided powerful evidence of the pernicious effects of segregation. Newly appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren led the court in May 1954 in overturning the Plessy separate but equal standard and declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The court postponed ordering a clear timetable to implement the decision, but a second Brown ruling the next year ordered desegregation to proceed with all deliberate speed. Southern whites declared their intention to nullify the Brown decision. As Southern school boards closed schools or transferred funds and property to white academies, defiant politicians issued a Southern manifesto and pledged to resist integration. In Little Rock, Arkansas, a judge ordered schools integrated in September 1957. Defying the court and Eisenhower, who had reluctantly supported Brown, Orville Forbes ordered the National Guard to keep African American children out of Central High. When troops were withdrawn, violence erupted, forcing President Eisenhower to put the Guard under federal control and send in more troops to integrate the school. The governor of Arkansas ordered Little Rock high schools not to open at all during the 1958-1959 school year. Brown opened the door to the use of federal courts to push for civil rights, but reluctant and federal and state government support weakened the strategy, and black communities realized that they would have to help themselves. Enter Martin Luther King and the SCLC. When the 381-day Montgomery bus boycott ended in victory, Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a prominent national figure. Martin Luther King was the middle-class son of a Baptist minister. He earned a Ph.D. at Boston University, where he was exposed to the non-violent civil disobedience of Gandhi and the pacifism of Northern intellectuals, including Bayard Rustin and Glenn Smiley. King combined the traditions of the black preacher with an intensely moral political strategy. In 1956, King laid out these principles in a speech celebrating the end of the bus boycott, and shortly afterward helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. King understood that not all Southerners were rabid bigots, and that playing the violent racists off against more moderate people could be a successful strategy for change. But the SCLC failed to gain mass black support, and the next great protest would arise out of an unlikely group, black college students. Black college students, first in Greensboro, North Carolina, took matters into their own hands and began sitting in at segregated lunch counters. Non-violent sit-ins were widely supported by the black community and often were accompanied by community-wide protests of businesses that would not integrate. Reverend James Lawson organized successful sit-ins in Nashville and developed rules of nonviolent conduct that became models. Atlanta's sit-in campaign, started in the fall of 1960 and supported by King, was massive and finally led to desegregation in September 1961. And so here we have some of the actions that are accompanied by the violent sit-in protests. A new spirit of militancy was evident among young people. Inspired by the longtime activist Ella Baker, 120 African-American activists created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, to promote nonviolent, direct challenges to segregation in 1960. The young activists were found at the forefront of nearly every major civil rights battle. The race issue played a surprisingly muted role in the 1960 presidential campaign. As vice president, Nixon had strongly supported civil rights, but it was Kennedy who pressured a judge to release Martin Luther King when he was jailed in Atlanta and faced a long sentence in a notorious state prison. Black voters provided Kennedy's margin of victory, although an unfriendly Congress ensured that little legislation would be enacted. Attorney General Robert Kennedy used the Justice Department to force compliance with desegregation orders, but could not solve JFK's dilemma of promoting civil rights without alienating Southern Democrats. James Farmer and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, sponsored Freedom Rides in May 1961, which integrated group ride interstate buses in the South. Although the FBI and Justice Department knew of the plans, they were absent when mobs in Alabama firebombed a bus in Anniston, attacked Freedom Riders in Birmingham, and severely beat passengers in Montgomery, paralyzing a white Freedom Rider and leaving future Congressman John Lewis with a concussion. There was more violence and no police protection at other stops. The Kennedy administration was forced to mediate safe passage for the riders, though 300 people were arrested. A Justice Department petition led to new rules that effectively ended interstate bus segregation. Although the Freedom Rides made the nation aware of violent racism, they also revealed the difficulty of forcing the federal government to take a stand, as moral persuasion alone could not bring change. Where the federal government was not present, segregationists could triumph. In Albany, Georgia, local authorities prevented the kind of violent white reaction that made the protesters' tactics effective and therefore newsworthy, so protests fizzled. Despite the presence of Dr. King, Albany remained as segregated as ever. When the federal government intervened, as it did at the University of Mississippi, important battles could be won. Governor Ross Barnett openly encouraged mob violence to prevent a black veteran, James Meredith, from enrolling in the fall of 1962. After several days of rioting, in which 2 were killed and hundreds, including 160 U.S. Marshals, were injured, Kennedy sent in 5,000 Army troops to restore order and force Meredith's admission. In conjunction with the SCLC, local activists in Birmingham, Alabama, planned a large desegregation campaign at the end of 1962. Demonstrators, including Martin Luther King, filled the city's jails. King penned his letter from Birmingham jail, which presented the movement's case to a wide audience. TV audiences were horrified to see water cannon and snarling dogs break up demonstrations, and bombs rocked SCLC headquarters, King's own home, and finally a black Birmingham church, where 4 girls were killed. This is despite an agreement by which white businessmen had pledged to desegregate and hire blacks. Birmingham changed the nature of the civil rights movement by bringing millions of Americans, white and black alike, together in support of civil rights, as well as mobilizing black unemployed and working poor for the first time. The shifting public consensus led President Kennedy to appeal for civil rights legislation in a nationally televised speech in June 1963, after Governor George Wallace had sought to prevent integration of the University of Alabama. While Kennedy asked Congress to pass civil rights legislation, civil rights leaders planned a march on Washington for jobs and freedom to force Kennedy's hand. Kennedy opposed the march and refused to speak, but over 250,000 people, including 50,000 whites, and a live national television audience heard King's stirring "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the next year, gaining international stature and demonstrating that the movement could not be ignored. The assassination of President Kennedy threw a cloud over the movement. The new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had never been much of a friend to the civil rights, but LBJ used his skills as a political insider to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The act put a virtual end to Jim Crow, but at a great cost to LBJ and his party, as the new law accelerated the political realignment of the South from the Democratic to the Republican Party, something that Johnson foretold but accepted as the price of justice. In 1964, civil rights activists led by Bob Moses of SNCC and David Dennis of CORE targeted Mississippi for Freedom Summer, during which 900 volunteers, many of them white Northern college students, exposed the culture's virulent racism. 2 white activists and a local black activist were quickly killed, and other deaths, beatings, and bombings followed. However, tensions developed between the white volunteers and the black movement veterans. The project riveted national attention on Mississippi, though the movement's strategy challenged the regular Democratic Party's delegation to the National Convention, however bringing only a token concession. Many African Americans became disillusioned with the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment leaders like Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's running mate in 1964. Frustrated with the limits of nonviolence in politics, many younger activists were drawn to the vision of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm, whose father had been killed by racists in Michigan when he was a child, had little patience with the nonviolent strategy of King. He ridiculed integrationist goals and urged black audience to break free from white domination. He broke with the Nation of Islam, making a pilgrimage to Mecca, and returned to America with changed views. He founded the Organization of African American Unity. However, this phase of his life was short-lived. On February 21st, 1964, he was assassinated. Even in death, he continued to point to a new black consciousness and became a martyr for the idea soon to be known as Black Power. With an overwhelming Democratic victory in the 1964 elections, movement leaders pushed for federal legislation to protect the right to vote. In Selma, Alabama, whites had systematically kept blacks off the voting lists and brutally repressed protests. A planned march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, ended when police beat marchers, sending 50 people to the hospital. A court injunction also threatened the march. Just when it would appear that the Selma campaign would fade, a white gang attacked a group of northern whites who had come out to help, killing one of them. President Johnson addressed the nation and thoroughly identified himself with the civil rights cause, concluding, "We shall overcome." The march went forward. In August 1965, LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act, which authorized federal supervision of voter registration in the South and led to a great leap in the number of black voters. And as you can see, based on this chart of the United States, how the impact of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had a massive significance to voter registration and how voting increased significantly between the years 1960 and 1971. Looking beyond the civil rights movement and into what was happening with other minorities, Mexican Americans had already formed groups such as LULAC to fight for their rights and used the courts to challenge discrimination. Legal and illegal Mexican immigration increased dramatically during and after World War II. During the 1950s, efforts to round up undocumented immigrants, known as Operation Wetback, led to a denial of basic rights and a Mexican distrust of Anglos. A new civil rights movement called La Raza linked the struggle of all Mexican Americans, whether they were in the country legally or not. Although Puerto Rican communities had been forming in New York City since the 1920s, the Great Migration came after World War II, as we saw with Mexicans. Despite being citizens, Puerto Ricans faced both economic and cultural discrimination. In the 1960s and 70s, they were hit hard by the decline in manufacturing jobs and urban decay. Like Mexicans, many Puerto Ricans responded to white hostility and indifference by emphasizing their Spanish language and Caribbean culture and joined the demand for bilingual education. And here we have a national convention of the League of United Latin American Citizens in Texas. World War II relocation camps had devastated the Japanese American community on the West Coast. But the reaction against Nazi racist doctrines softened some of the anti-Japanese racism, and the Japanese American Citizens League was able to win important legislative victories in California. First-generation Japanese Americans became eligible for U.S. citizenship with the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act. This act abolished racial restrictions in U.S. laws going back to the Naturalization Act of 1790, though it retained a quota and preference system which determined which ethnic groups were more desirable. By 1965, 46,000, the majority of all the SA, had become citizens. American Indians also experienced significant changes. During the 1950s, Congress passed a series of termination bills that ended tribal rights in return for cash payments and the division of tribal assets. Indian activists challenged government policies, leading to court decisions that reasserted the principle of tribal sovereignty. Indians who had left the reservation often found themselves losing their tribal identities, and urban Indians focused on civil instead of tribal rights. As with other groups, a series of Indian organizations appeared through the 1960s, and Indians began to emphasize civil rights more than tribal rights, but contradictions between Indian and tribal identity often weakened the movement. In the egalitarian political climate of civil rights legislation in 1965, a new Immigration and Nationality Act abolished the national origins quota system. Increased opportunities for Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asians to immigrate to the United States. Filipinos, Chinese, and Koreans especially took advantage of the law. The law's provisions for family reunification led to chain immigration and sponsorship, while provisions encouraged immigration of skilled workers, brought many healthcare professionals and managers from Asia. Because the new law substituted hemispheric for national quotas, undocumented immigration from Latin America also mushroomed. By the 1980s, more than 90% of immigrants, legal and illegal, came from Asia and Latin America.